Today in the EU, unity, Ukraine, and the future of NATO at the DC summit.
Group of countries who come together to share values, that share a commitment to share.
Russia cannot win this war, and it must be held accountable for all Ukraine.
Since Russia's aggression against Ukraine began in 2014, NATO has fundamentally transformed.
All eyes this week are on the NATO summit taking place in Washington, D.C. to mark the military alliance's 75th anniversary with a collective message about unity. NATO leaders will be discussing a variety of topics, with the elephant in the room being Ukraine's potential membership. But what other topics will be on the agenda, and which factors are shading NATO's unity? Hello and welcome. I am Evi Kiori, and this is Today in the EU. To dive into the NATO summit and leaders' priorities, I'm joined by our politics reporter, Aurélie Pugnet. So NATO marks its 75th anniversary this year, kicking off the celebration with its summit in Washington.
NATO is the most successful alliance in history because we have been able to be together despite the fact that we are 32 different nations with different political parties, with different history, with different culture.
Aurélie, you're there right now in DC following the summit. So what's the main message NATO is trying to communicate these days?
The main message that we can expect the 32 allies of the military alliance of NATO over the next few days are obviously that they want to continue supporting Ukraine in its war against Russia and trying to help Ukraine defend itself, keep on going defending itself with more military deliveries and pledging a lot more money into defense and into collective security. And the second message definitely that we can expect is this supposed unity that there is within all the 32 allies and also with all their partners across the world. We're expecting Latin American countries as well as Indo-Pacific countries joining in over the next few days in a show of partnership and unity and interest in working together.
And besides the anniversary celebration, NATO is having now a new Secretary General, Mark Rutte. We've talked about him quite extensively in the previous episodes of the podcast. But what are the expectations for the new leadership?
Mark Rutte was indeed confirmed as Secretary General just a few weeks ago, and he will be taking over in October 1st when Jens Stoltenberg will be leaving. So Mark Rutte is currently back home in Europe, and it's his successor that's going to attend the summit. But what we see already is that the allies have started saying what they're actually interested in Rutte doing when he comes in a few months. And we can see that him stepping back is definitely going to help him preparing for this. We've been hearing that he's going to have to balance out a lot of his time and his energy and his ability to craft compromises between the US on one side, where obviously we expect Donald Trump maybe to come back to the White House, and he's obviously a huge critic of NATO. And on the other hand, the smaller member states, especially on the Eastern Front, that have been battling against the perception that Russia will be attacking again. This is going to be a big deal for him because he's going to have to manage the two sides just as much as he's going to have to manage the relationship between the EU, which wants to play a much larger role in security and defense, with NATO, which is still seen as the cornerstone, they say, of collective security and defense.
Now, the celebrations look all good, and the unity message is something that the North Atlantic Alliance needs these days. But what is happening behind closed doors? Things don't seem as rosy, especially with what you mentioned that is being discussed about Ukraine and Russia. So what are the latest developments in Ukraine?
Indeed, you said it quite well. What we see is that the allies have been trying to prove and show that they will support Ukraine for, they say, as long as it takes. That said, when it comes into what that means in practice, it's actually quite different because, for example, Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said that he wanted the allies to commit to a multi-annual pledge to continue support to Ukraine. And what we saw in the results is that actually it would be a one-year pledge and a commitment to continue spending around or at least 40 billion a year in supporting Ukraine militarily.
Where do the NATO leaders stand?
There are two ways of seeing this. Some say that a multi-annual pledge is not possible, actually, because you need to involve the ministries of finance, and it's just not doable in certain countries like the US, for example, to just assume that you can promise money over a long term, whereas others say, well, we do need something that help Ukraine seeing long term and have perspective into looking into what kind of support they will get over the next few years. So the idea in the first place was to have a multi-annual pledge where the allies would say, well, I promise Ukraine that we will send you that much amount of money over the next few years, and that will help Ukraine, making sure that they have perspective and can count on that much military assistance over the next few years. What happened is that this idea that was meant to, they say, Trump-proof the support to Ukraine. So that means making sure they can't be stopped by governments coming in the next few months and could want to actually stop that aid flowing into Ukraine. What happened is, in the end, that pledge was actually brought down to 1 year, and with a commitment to review it over the next few years. And of course, it's a promise at the end of the day. So it just rests on a promise. And we do know that promises aren't always kept. That's the issue with governments and politics.
And another loud discussion that is going on outside of NATO, and I'm wondering if it is going to be a part of the discussions within NATO, is if Ukraine is going to join the alliance. What can we expect here?
What is stopping Ukraine from joining the alliance is, first and foremost, that it's still at war. It has been a long stance that countries at war just don't join the alliance. And the second issue is that Ukraine has to do reforms. The fact that Ukraine has to do reforms is being held against them, basically, by especially the US and Germany, who say that the focus at the moment is on Ukraine finishing the war and also finishing a bunch of reforms to be more democratic, basically, and just tackle corruption. Well, we hear a lot about Ukrainian reforms at the moment. So this is kind of held against them. That is also held as a reason to not want to speed up the process and not to show them the road to like a very clear path to membership yet. So what you will hear is this concept of a bridge. So Ukraine will be put on a bridge. What this just means is that the allies will continue to support Ukraine, and they will continue to modernize its army and things like this.
All the work we are doing together is making Ukraine stronger, more interoperable, and better prepared than ever to join our alliance,
said NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg at press conference in Brussels ahead of the upcoming Washington summit.
So that means accompanying it in its reform. And the biggest question is whether everyone agrees that this path will not stop and that Ukraine will one day be joining the alliance, or whether the allies want to put additional conditions on it and maybe link, again, like they did last year, the fact that one day Ukraine will join to the fact that it has done the reforms. And this link and how strong it is the one currently under discussion. But there will be no invitation this week. That is absolutely for sure.
And what about Russia? What's the general attitude towards the country?
The relationship of NATO towards Russia at the moment is very much around that war that they started in Ukraine, right? Russia is definitely considered one of the two main threats of the alliance, and so that's Russia and terrorism. And some members have been calling for NATO to find a new comprehensive, they say, or complex, that's been another word, way of defining the relationship to Russia. So a full plan, if you will. Like if tomorrow Russia wants to negotiate and sit around the table with us, what do we do? Some countries would say, yes, let's sit down. Some countries would say, no. Part of the discussion is to have an overarching strategy towards Russia that is not only based on actually the war in Ukraine, but that hasn't happened yet, and it's definitely not for this summit. They have plenty on the agenda already.
Well, besides the obvious then, Russia and Ukraine, which will monopolize, as we mentioned, the attention of the world leaders quite a bit, what else will be on the agenda?
One big deal is definitely the relationship with the partners, they say, in the Indo-Pacific. So that's actually the relationship with Japan, with South Korea, with Australia and New Zealand. While some say that this partnership with those countries is not only based on finding a way to counter China and making sure that they have a relationship with them in case anything happens with China, be it a war, being any attack, be it any sort of sour relationship. What is actually interesting is that they will sign some deals as to how to counter maybe hybrid attacks and how to share information, and actually just about having a closer relationship. And if you look at a map, NATO turning to those countries and having a relationship with them that is much stronger than they did, 5 years ago, shows how NATO is basically circling all around the West, but actually further and all around the Northern Hemisphere.
Now, this meeting is taking place in Washington, and of course, you also mentioned it, Donald Trump's position on NATO isn't the most favorable, I would say, and everyone remembers his quote on countries meeting GDP targets in order to be members of the alliance.
I said, everybody's going to pay. They said, well, if we don't pay, are you still going to protect us? I said, absolutely not. They couldn't believe the answer. And everybody, you never saw more money pour in to Secretary General Stoltenberg.
This is what Trump said. So will money be a part of the discussion again? And if so, what is expected on this front?
Money is a huge part of the discussion at this point because the US administration is obviously fretting a little bit about Donald Trump coming back, and he's been criticizing the allies quite badly in saying that they don't meet the target that they set for themselves, which is spending 2% of their GDP on defense. What you will definitely hear over the next few days is those allies coming forward and saying, look how much we've done, look how much we're spending now. Now there are 23 out of 32 meeting that target. What is interesting to see is that it's definitely used in a way to prove Trump and also maybe anyone that could be critical towards the unfair burden sharing between the allies, but also it's a message towards Russia in saying, look how much we're spending. We're ready for this. We're ready in the long haul, and you will not wait us out because we're making plans. So you will hear those messages of will, of promises.
And we've witnessed a series of elections here in Europe, including the European elections, the UK elections, then the French elections last week. And in November, citizens will vote in the US as well. Do you see these external political dynamics and developments influencing the way the discussions will be held within NATO's closed doors?
Elections taking place all throughout the military alliance definitely does impact the way it works and the trust also that is being put in each other and the way the work is conducted. What is interesting to see is that the elections that have been taking place so far have only slightly impacted, especially the work on support to Ukraine. We've seen how they've been trying to institutionalize the support to Ukraine, make it Trump-proof, as I said earlier, and also how they try to make sure that the alliance won't be shaken too much with all of those government changes. One government that has impacted this a little bit is that in Slovakia, because they halted the state deliveries to Ukraine, but the industry is still doing it. So there is definitely a bit of fretting. We don't know what's going to happen in France. We don't know what's going to happen in the US over the coming months. But in general, the military alliance is not like the EU. It's a bit sheltered from those big changes because it's resting on security and defense and on the promise that they made to each other, they would defend themselves. So even if there is a lot of political pressure on it, it won't be as damaging now that a few of those commitments, especially towards Ukraine, have been taken, at least in the next few months. What would be interesting to see is in 1 year, if those commitments will be renewed and if the 40 billion pledge will continue to go on for another year. That's, I think, the biggest question.
Thank you very much, Aurélie. I am Evi Chiori, and this was Today in the EU podcast. Visit Euractiv to stay on top of the latest news, sign up for our podcast newsletter, and if you haven't subscribed yet, you can find us on all streaming platforms. And please make sure to leave a comment or review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Your reviews help us a lot to spread the word about our work. This episode was produced by Miriam Sáenz de Tejada, Nicoleta Iota, and me. Thank you for tuning in, and until tomorrow morning.